Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great, good. So this originally wasn't going to be a video, but I figured it might be of appeal to some people. I want to be clear at the outset that this is not a how-to in restoring a fishing rod. I learned as I went along, and I made plenty of mistakes. This is more of a diary of a little project that I started some weeks back and might serve as an instructive example as to some of the things not to do if you're going to do the same thing. So back in July, I showed an old fishing rod that belonged to my grandfather that I intended on using, and even bought a brand new Zepco 33 for it. Now, since then, I had a change of mind, or though perhaps it's better put that I've taken a diversion on the way there. I decided that I wanted to fix up the rod before I used it. Now, the reason for that was obvious. The line guides were horrific. The blank was scratched up, and the cork handle was heavily discolored. Now, none of this precluded its use, but I figured that if I was putting on a brand new reel and fresh line, I may as well fix up the rod a little bit as well. Now, I'm going to say at the beginning that this was not a down to the bare wood restoration. I just addressed the most egregious things. This is because I have no experience working on a fishing rod, and I didn't really want to risk destroying what was, for me personally, a piece of family history. Now, like many of my projects, what began as an intended mild refresh of something rapidly spun out of control and became far larger than I had intended. Anyway, with that preamble out of the way, let's begin. So I decided to start easy, and that was to clean the cork handle. Now, after doing some research, it seems that Mr. Clean Magic Erasers are a popular choice for cleaning cork handles. And after using it, I can see why. Magic is truly the appropriate word because every wipe literally cleaned away 5 decades of dirt and sweat and whatever else was infused into the cork. As you can see from the before and after pictures, 30 seconds of work resulted in a night and day difference. And as you can see from the cleaning pad itself, that an ungodly amount of work was pulled from the cork. And here you go, that's the end result. So with a clean cork handle, I plan to use some filler to start closing up the holes that were in the cork. Then some cork sealer to waterproof it and preserve it. The next step, however, is where the hard part began. Now, the reason why I began this project in the first place was to replace the line guides. In fact, it was the only thing that I originally wanted to do. And as you can see from the first 2 pictures, which I don't think actually accurately convey how god-awful they really were, the line guides had no inserts, assuming that they ever did, were slightly rusty, and likely would have actually damaged any line run through them. So that means I would have to do something for the first time in my life. Remove and replace line guides. That meant an online crash course in articles and videos. Thus fortified, I grabbed the razor blade and gently cut off the 3 line guides. It was actually easier than I had anticipated. The guides had been held in place by wrapped thread and a fairly thin layer of epoxy. The rod tip proved to be even easier to remove. A little bit of heat and some pliers and gently popped off. This picture shows what they look like and the line guides and tip that I actually replaced them with. Now, I bought the new line guides and tip from Amazon, and I'm mildly impressed by the kit that I bought. It came with nearly everything I needed to do the job: epoxy, wrapping thread, shears, tape, and brushes. Next move was to wrap some line guides, and time again for more videos and articles on this because, as I said before, I had no idea how to do this. The first step was to place a line guide where I intended it to go and to secure it to the rod with a little bit of tape. The second step well, wrapped thread, of course. And as you can see the results in this next picture, I will confess that I did a serviceable job. I think what would have made the job a lot easier was that tool that rod builders use to hold and spin the blank around while you're wrapping thread. Now, I don't own one, so I had to use what I had. And in my case, it was gun rest. Although that made the job easier, I still needed 3 hands to do the job. One to turn the rod, one to hold the thread, and one to ensure that the thread was actually wrapping evenly on the rod. At any rate, each of the 3 guides pretty much have the same quality of work, I'm using that term loosely, as you can see by this picture and the following one. Now the rod tip, not surprisingly, was the easiest one to install. A little bit of sandpaper to scratch up the rod tip, some epoxy, put the tip on, Bob's your uncle, you're done. I decided to apply the epoxy to the line guide wraps later though, once I took care of some other things. I wanted to turn my attention back to the cork handle. Now, as I said earlier, the cork handle was clean, but it was still in pretty rough shape. Now, I don't know if that was actually natural to the cork, damage from use, or maybe a combination of both. Now, fixing cork isn't actually that hard. The cheapest way to fill holes and gouges on cork is to just get some super glue and mix in some sawdust. Insert into hole, sit back proud. The second way is a little bit pricier, but basically follows the same process. Wood filler. I opted for that and found some pre-tinted filler, which was close enough in color. Now I picked one spot to test and then began building it up with filler. After letting it set overnight, I then checked the next day and the color was good enough, so I hit the rest of the handle with it. Now, as you can see from this picture, the end result wasn't life-changing, but actually does look a lot better in person than it does here. I followed that up with a light sanding, which made it look even better, and then prepared for the next step, putting the cork sealer on. Now, this stuff does not smell particularly good, so I'm cautiously optimistic that it means it actually works well over the long haul as a protective seal. It goes on with a milky white color, but it does dry clear. I put 2 coats on to be sure and declared the handle finished. Now, I'm not a big fan of the feeling once it's dried. It doesn't really feel like cork, but rather like a lightly plasticized handle. And it's got a sheen to it. I don't know if that's coming across on camera. Nothing's perfect though. So that done, I wanted to address the rod blank again. Now, I had set out to apply clear coat once I epoxied the line guides in their wraps. But before that, I wanted to address some of the discoloration on the rod's shaft caused by all of the scratches and damages over the years. My initial plan was to use a furniture refinishing marker, and I picked the darkest color I could find. I believe this is dark brown, to match the existing color, and it was a bad idea. The problem with furniture markers is that they're, well, markers. Tackling one of the largest spots yielded something that looked awful, like I used a marker. So I decided to scrub that plan. A few days later, my brother-in-law, looking at my efforts to date, offered that I should just simply repaint the rod. You know how you have thoughts of what you should do, but only do it once someone kind of nudges you in that direction? Well, my brother-in-law's opinion pushed me to the direction that I should have went to in the first place. So my path was set. Sand down the rod blank to remove the old clear coat and paint and redo it all. I didn't want to do it, partly out of trying to preserve as much of the original look as possible, and partly because this little quick restoration project had already grown larger than I had intended. However, with that decision made, I returned to the line guides. It was time to start epoxying the wraps to secure the line guides permanently. This was the moment I was simultaneously looking forward to and dreading. Now, the pictures you're seeing only show the first coating. I eventually went to 3 coats, so it's much smoother than the initial coating, which shows the thread ties around the rod. It's here where I truly learned the value of having the right equipment for the job, like that rod spinner that I mentioned before. Professional rod builders and amateur enthusiasts also use it while the epoxy is drying. Epoxy, like most liquids, has a tendency to settle to the lowest point while wet. So while each application of epoxy had dried, the next day I would find slight pools of epoxy on the underside of whatever side was facing up. Slowly spinning the rod would have probably prevented that. By the 3rd coat, I was literally sitting next to the rod and turning it slightly every few minutes. Unfortunately, that didn't do much to prevent the pooling. While the end result doesn't look bad, it doesn't look great either. I was really hoping for that kind of smooth torpedo shape on the line guide bases that you see on, well, professionally done fishing rods. Instead, I got a slightly curvy epoxy mount on those bases. I suppose it could be worse. Whatever else, once the epoxy dried, I doubt that God or man would be able to remove those line guides without cutting them off. Anyway, that done, back to the rod shaft itself. Incidentally, on the first picture at the extreme left, you can actually see the results of trying to use that furniture marker I mentioned earlier. Now, I figured that trying to match the original paint color was probably going to be impossible. I decided to try and get close, but live with the inevitable difference. Besides, it was really difficult to determine what the original color was, given that the clear coat layer had yellowed. So I reckoned that I would sand the wooden blank to remove all of the messed up clear coating and paint. Now, nearer to the handle, there is a plastic bit, and as you can see in the picture, it too had a coating of clear coat that had yellowed. And the plan for this was to remove that clear coat as well. This turned out to actually be more complicated than I expected because there was a wrapped thread on this part, and removing the clear coat there would inevitably damage that wrap. So I would have to be extremely careful. Now, the sanding of the wood itself was pretty simple. I wrapped all the line wraps that I'd done with tape so I wouldn't damage that hard work. A piece of finer grit sandpaper and patience, and in short order the clear coat and paint were gone. I'm going to be honest with you, I felt kind of sad by this. That paint had survived longer than I've been alive. The plastic bit, though, turned out to be far more difficult. So I initially had started scraping off the yellowed clear coat paint with the edge of a knife blade, but it was damaging that brittle plastic. So I tried a quick blast of fire, and although it seemed to have borne fruit initially with that clear coat cracking, it still proved to be too difficult to easily remove. So I did what every good redneck does. I grabbed the Dremel. Of course, I had to experiment with what to use. A grinder was too much, and even a leather wheel damaged some of the threads. Finally, however, I had the white plastic parts cleaned off of clear coat. Now, I decided to leave the clear coat lacquer on the threaded parts simply to avoid damaging them. And at the end of the day, I really don't think it would have made much aesthetic difference. Now, there is one place that I didn't touch, and that was the section with the original markings, which stated that it was manufactured and sold by Canadian Tire. Now, it looks rough, and the paint doesn't match the rest of the restored rod, but I figured that it should stay there. It only seemed right. So after all of that hard work, I decided to do something a little bit easier. Sand and repaint the rod seat. Wasn't all that hard. I used a brass wire wheel and it made short work of the original paint. It also damaged some of the cork handle that was attached to the rod seat due to my imperfect aiming of the wheel. And it also teaches me not to use an old battered wire wheel. At any rate, after repairing the cork handle, I hit the rod seat with some dark brown paint. wasn't the same color, espresso according to the can, and I really wish I had opted for the even darker dark walnut brown that I had debated over for 10 minutes in the store. That said, the end result is pretty good. It looks far lighter in the picture than it does in person. As the son of a man who earned his livelihood as one of the better house painters the city has witnessed, I'm a little ashamed to say that I've rarely picked up a paintbrush. No fear, no favor, however, it was time to paint the rod. Now, I have to admit that here is where I may have made another mistake, which is going to gnaw at me a little bit for some time. The choice of color. When I went to the store to pick up the paint for the rod, I went by memory as to its color. So I kind of accidentally-ish chose a paint which was lighter than the rod originally was. And as soon as I started spraying, I realized how much lighter. At that point, however, I was committed and there wasn't much that I could do about it. Had I repainted the entire rod, it really wouldn't have been an issue, but I did leave that 5-inch section near the beginning of the rod with the original paint and markings. So it's quite obvious that the repainted section is lighter compared to the original. That said, it's fine, and I'll live with it. So if this has been a journey, the end has to be the clear coating of the rod. Before that, though, let's address the question of the butt of the rod. Now, it is of metal, but I can't determine what kind outside that it's not magnetic. So that rules out nickel, stainless steel, or iron. My guess is some kind of aluminum that has been colored yellow. Now, color matching that particular shade of yellow proved to be impossible, so I decided to go for an aged bronze spray paint, and a few quick blasts and it covered up the battered surface. That out of the way, it was now time to screw everything up and apply the clear coat. Now I know what you're saying. How do you screw up clear coat? Well, that, friends, is easily explained. I hit that rod with clear coat like it owed me money. I heavily sprayed the entire length of the rod, and at first everything seemed to be okay. That is until I noticed that the paint near the beginning of the rod started to actually split apart. And then slowly over the coming minutes, that split grew. There were a few minor imperfections on other sections of the rod, but this part was obvious and just unacceptable. I mean, you know what? When you run a long race, finally get to the finish line, are just about to cross it, and then fall down, it's a little demoralizing. Faced with this cock-up, I did what any self-respecting man would do. I took a shortcut. Instead of starting all over again on the entire rod, I just bought some 600 and 1500 grit sandpaper, and I sanded that affected section. And it worked. Well, sort of. While I was able to fix most of the screwed up clear coat job, I did have to repaint a section of the rod because I was a little too eager with that 600 grit. Well, that and the rod seat as well, because apparently my brain confused 600 and 1500 grit sandpaper and really went to town on that as well. So, crisis averted and lesson learned, make triple sure that you adequately prepare the surface of anything you're painting or clear coating, and then check it again. So I decided to instead apply another coat of paint to both the rod blank and the reel seat. My concern was that the sole layer of paint that I had on both was just too thin to stand up to the rigors of being knocked around in a boat. Actually, I ended up repainting the reel seat like 3 times because I kept screwing up either the painting or the alleged light sanding between layers. I really got to learn how to sand. The messed up section of the rod took paint really poorly, so I had to actually do that twice as well. Now, that said, while I'm not overjoyed with the quality of the painting on the rod as a whole, it is a definite, it is what it is proposition. The problem with learning as you go is that your first job is obviously never going to be as good as your 10th job. Anyway, having learned my lesson from the first failed application of clear coat, this time I lightly sprayed the first 2 coats, separated by about 20 minutes each. Yes, I actually read the damn can this time. And then finally, I hit it with a third and final heavier coat, though not that heavy, at least not like the first time. And how did it turn out? Well, a careful eye will notice many imperfections with the end result, and if they aren't, I'll be happy to point them out myself. But I think it actually turned out reasonably well. I would have preferred to hue a little closer to the original colors of the rod, but I worked with what I had. You'll see the pictures in the video. You be the judge as to the quality of the end result. Anyway, I guess it's time to actually evaluate this. From a cost perspective, this was a giant waste of money. Even brand new, this rod wasn't top of the line. I don't know what fishing rods like this cost at Canadian Tire back in the late 1960s, but even throwing a few dollars at this in 2023 was probably a waste. And of course, I threw far more than a few dollars at it. So for materials, 2 cans of spray paint, $16.95 each. That comes to $33.90. A spray can of aged bronze paint, $22.95. Enamel clear coat, $20.99. Rod tip repair kit, $28.16. Replacement guides, $15. Cork renew, $15. 600 grit sandpaper, $7. 1500 grit sandpaper, $9. For a total of $151.92. And of course, this doesn't even value my time. Even at a few weeks, I'm not sure that's a great cost, but it still has a cost. Nor does it include the Zebco 33 spin cast reel I bought for it earlier for $61.64. Still, $151.92, even in our debased Canadian dollars, could have bought me a great fishing rod. So yes, I spent far too much on this little project. That said, this was never about money. This fishing rod belonged to my grandfather, and really it's the only thing I have left from him. He used this rod through the late 1960s and all throughout the 70s, and quite possibly my father as well when he joined my grandfather on fishing trips. And as such, it was more about honoring that past. Anyway, let's judge the finished product. So, I'm okay without how the cork handle turned out, though in retrospect, I might not have put this cork protector on. It gives that the handle a different feeling, like I mentioned earlier, than untreated cork. And not to mention the end result is a little bit darker because of that treatment. Lesson learned. I'll include the metal butt in this section and just simply say that it turned out okay. Not great, but just okay. I'm not really 100% sold on the paint that I ended up using on it. Now, the reel seat turned out fine, though I wish I had used that dark walnut paint on it. I think it would have been closer to the original color. The original paint also had kind of like a rough texture to it that I kind of wish I tried to emulate somehow. Now, the rod blank itself. Well, the paint job and clear coat turned out about as well as one could expect without the equipment to do it properly. It does look better than when I started it out, but it also looks like a complete amateur did the work on it. In fact, the more I look at it now, the worse it actually looks. I'm still not sure I made the right decision to leave this first section of the rod untouched. I did want to preserve the original markings, but it looks noticeably rougher than the rest of the rod. I do wonder if maybe I should have attempted to do some more light work on it. Now, the line guides turned out quite nicely. Although my kind of line wrapping left a little bit to be desired and my application of epoxy certainly could have been better, the line guides are on securely. This was probably the hardest part of the job on a technical level, and in my estimation, actually turned out to be the best work that I did on it. So, overall, for a fishing rod restoration by a guy who's never done it before and basically learned everything while he was doing it, I'd say it turned out reasonably well. Now, is a 5-foot long 60-year-old fishing rod with a spin cast reel the best way to catch fish? Probably not. Meanwhile, anyone need a couple of cans of spray paint? At any rate, I hope you found today's video to at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope all of your adventures on the water include tight lines and big fish. Take care, and bye-bye.